If you were standing over the open ocean at midnight, you could be right above the biggest migration on Earth and never know it. Nothing would be crossing the horizon. No giant herd would be running beneath the moon. From the surface, the sea might look almost blank. Meanwhile, underneath that darkness, a huge mass of life would already be on its way up. For a while, the first clue made even less sense than the migration itself. Scientists were trying to measure the seafloor when they found a layer deep in the water that looked like another bottom. The strange part was not just that it appeared where no bottom should be. After sunset, it rose. Before morning, it dropped again. That should have been impossible. The ocean floor does not climb at night and sink before sunrise. So the layer was not rock. It was not mud. It was alive. Every evening, across vast areas of the sea, animals leave the deeper dark and head toward the surface. By the middle of the night, water that seemed almost empty during the day is crowded with feeding, hunting, drifting, chasing, avoiding, and surviving. A few hours later, much of that life slips back down again, and the ocean returns to looking still from above. That is the basic shape of the event. The deeper you go into it, the stranger it gets. Most people do not imagine the ocean this way. They picture waves on top, fish somewhere underneath, then a lot of empty water below that. It feels simple from land. Even from a boat, open sea often looks like one of the least busy places on Earth. That impression is completely wrong. A calm ocean can hide an enormous amount of motion. The reason this migration stays out of the average person's mental picture is obvious once you think about it. Human beings are good at noticing movement that goes sideways. We see herds crossing land. We notice birds filling the sky. A river run makes immediate sense because the route is visible. This event does not give us any of that. The traffic goes up through black water, not across the horizon, and much of it is carried out by animals most people would not recognize if they saw them in a photo. That makes the scale harder to feel at first. When people hear largest migration on Earth, they expect a familiar cast. They think of wildebeest, caribou, geese, maybe whales. They do not think of lanternfish, copepods, krill, shrimp-like drifters, larval animals, jelly-like creatures, and small midwater predators rising together after dark. Yet that is exactly the point. The ocean does not always become impressive by putting one huge animal in front of you. Sometimes it works the other way. It takes something tiny, repeats it on an absurd scale, and turns a collection of overlooked bodies into one of the largest biological movements on the planet. That is what happens here. Night starts to spread over the water. Light fades in the upper ocean. Then the climb begins. Tiny grazers move up because food is easier to reach near the surface. Fish that depend on those grazers adjust their own depth. Other predators respond to that shift. Different species rise from different layers, at different speeds, under slightly different rules. But the result is the same. A huge section of the ocean changes where life is concentrated. By midnight, the water column is not organized the way it was in daylight. That is a good moment to stop and really notice what this means. We are not talking about a few animals wandering into better conditions. We are talking about a repeated rearrangement of the sea. A layer that sat deep for most of the day now hangs much closer to the surface. Activity fills water that looked nearly empty a few hours earlier. Then dawn approaches. Exposure starts to matter again, and the whole pattern begins to reverse. If you only saw the ocean from above, you would miss almost all of it. That gap between appearance and reality is what makes the story so strong. The sea keeps looking quiet, while something huge is happening underneath. For a long time, people had no clear sense of how large this was. Nets could bring strange creatures out of the dark, but a net does not show you a living layer moving over time. You can sample the ocean without really seeing its structure. What changed everything was sound. Researchers began using echo sounding to measure depth. The method seemed simple enough. Send sound downward, wait for the return, and read the shape of the world below the ship. In theory, the strongest echo should mark the seafloor. Instead, something deep in the water kept reflecting sound, as though it were solid. At first, that looked like a technical oddity. Maybe the reading was bad. Maybe the instruments had caught something temporary. Maybe the ocean was producing a confusing signal for reasons nobody understood yet. Then people watched the pattern more carefully and noticed a detail that made the whole thing impossible to ignore. The layer moved with the light. It sat deeper during the day. Once evening came, it rose. Near sunrise, it went down again. Now the mystery had changed shape. This was no longer a simple mapping problem. Either the tools were misleading everyone in the same way, over and over, or the ocean was hiding a moving boundary inside itself. The tools were not the issue. What sonar had found was a dense concentration of animals. There were so many bodies in that part of the water, and they reflected sound so effectively that the ocean briefly pretended to have another bottom, suspended above the real one. That discovery still has force, because it changes the feel of the sea in a single moment. You think you are measuring depth. What you are actually detecting is life gathered so densely that it impersonates geology. Once that clicks, the open ocean stops feeling empty. It becomes layered. It becomes timed. It becomes crowded in ways that human eyes were never going to pick up from the deck of a ship. This is where the story starts to widen. The migration is interesting on its own, but the false bottom makes it clear that the ocean is not just hosting a nightly event. It is running a system. One part of the water is used one way in daylight. The same water means something different after sunset. By morning, the whole map changes again. That is why this is more than a cool fact about marine life. It tells you that the sea has a daily shift change, and the shift change is big enough to fool instruments. Imagine being alone on a research vessel years ago, staring at the return from the sounder and trying to make sense of it. There is a line down there that looks solid enough to be bottom. Then night comes, and the line rises. Dawn returns, and it sinks again. You would not just be surprised. You would feel that something fundamental about the water was missing from your understanding. That feeling was correct. The ocean had been hiding a vertical rush hour all along. The animals involved are not especially famous, which is one reason the story still feels underappreciated. A single lanternfish does not have the instant emotional impact of a whale. One drifting grazer looks like a detail, not a headline. A translucent crustacean in a jar is not the sort of creature people build myths around. But the ocean does not care what captures human imagination first. It runs on scale, timing, and repetition. Here, repetition is everything. This movement is not rare. It is not saved for one dramatic season. Across huge areas of ocean, some version of the same logic comes back every evening. The exact species can vary. Depths change from place to place. Conditions are not identical everywhere. But the pattern is widespread enough that it becomes part of the normal rhythm of marine life. Night opens a brief opportunity. A vast amount of life takes it. Morning closes that opportunity again. That is the outer shape. The inner logic is even better. The surface is rich, but it is not safe. That tension drives almost everything. Near the top of the ocean, sunlight powers the growth of phytoplankton. This is where a great deal of the food web gets its energy. Tiny drifting animals gather there to feed. Small fish come after them. Larger hunters respond to that concentration. If you are looking for a reason animals would risk a climb from deeper water, food is a big part of the answer. But food alone does not explain timing. If the surface were simply the best place to eat, many of these animals would stay there all day. They do not. The reason is visibility. For a small body in the ocean, being easy to see is dangerous in a very direct way. Daylight brightens the upper water and makes shapes easier to detect. A creature that can blend into dimmer depths becomes much easier to find when the sun is strong above it. In a place full of eyes, outlines, shadows, flashes, and movement matter. That is why so much of midwater life spends the day lower down. The deeper layers are darker, colder, and less productive, but they offer cover. The surface offers more feeding opportunity, yet that same zone becomes much riskier once the light is strong enough to reveal you. So the question is not simply where the food is. The real question is when the cost of reaching it becomes acceptable. That is where darkness changes everything. As evening drains light out of the upper ocean, the balance shifts. The danger does not vanish. Predators are still there. Nothing about the sea becomes gentle. What changes is the visibility. For a few hours, water that was too exposed during the day becomes usable enough to enter. That is why the migration feels so tightly organized around time. These animals are not moving because they enjoy the night. They are moving because darkness changes the price of being near the surface. Once you see it that way, the whole event sharpens. This is not a casual rise. It is a daily negotiation between hunger and exposure. Food pulls upward. Risk presses downward. Night loosens the pressure just enough for a climb. Then the light comes back and the deal ends. Different species handle that window differently. Some begin to rise in twilight, others wait longer. Certain animals stay in shallower ranges, while others travel from much deeper water. Nothing about the movement is as clean as a single wave rolling upward through the sea. From a distance, sonar may show a band. Inside that band, there is a crowded set of decisions happening all at once. That matters, because it keeps the migration from becoming too neat in your imagination. This is not a parade. It feels more like pressure releasing through an ecosystem. The upper ocean darkens, and more life can afford to enter it. Predators adjust. Prey adjusts. One movement triggers another. By the time the night is fully in place, water that looked almost empty from above is full of activity. Then dawn starts to erase that possibility. Animals that fed near the surface begin their descent. The upper layers thin out. The deeper dark fills back in. Before long, the sea looks quiet again, and anybody who never knew this system existed would have no clue that one of the largest animal movements on Earth had just played out below. That is such a powerful mismatch. We often assume big natural events should make themselves obvious. This one does the opposite. It stays hidden in the wrong direction, at the wrong time of day, through the wrong cast of creatures for human attention. The ocean has basically taken one of its largest daily movements and buried it inside darkness and depth. Even now, that concealment is part of the fascination. A person can live near the sea their whole life and never once picture what happens under open water after sunset. They might imagine storms, whales, coral reefs, sharks, tides, ships, currents. Very few people imagine the midwater world climbing toward the surface by the millions and billions every night. Yet that climb is fundamental. The open ocean is not just a stack of water layers sitting there passively. It is a place where light redraws the map every day. Noon and midnight do not simply make the sea look different. They make different parts of the water column more or less usable. That change is enough to move an immense amount of life. Once you understand that, even ordinary descriptions of the ocean begin to feel incomplete. Saying the surface is calm tells you almost nothing important. Calm from above can mean intense movement below. A blank horizon does not mean emptiness. Stillness, in this case, is just the appearance the ocean offers to creatures who cannot see through it. The migration also becomes more impressive the moment you think about distance, from the animal's point of view. For many of these creatures, the nightly trip is not a minor adjustment. It can mean moving through hundreds of meters of water. Pressure changes, temperature changes, predator exposure changes. The whole environment shifts as they climb. That is not wandering. That is a serious commute. A small animal leaving deeper water is entering a busier and riskier part of the sea, because the feeding payoff is worth it for a limited amount of time. Stay too deep, and you miss the richest upper layers. Come up too early, and you are exposed. Linger too long, and sunrise catches you in the wrong place. That tension gives the migration a quiet intensity. It may look graceful on a graph. For the animals inside it, the timing has consequences. This is probably why the event lingers in the mind once you understand it. The migration is large, but size is not the only reason it feels important. It is also precise, hidden, and necessary. It is built around a narrow daily window that opens, fills with life, and closes again. Nothing about that is accidental. The ocean has been running this pattern for a very long time, long before ships, sonar, or science gave it a name. Long before people could measure a scattering layer or talk about the twilight zone. The same basic pressure was already there. The surface held more food. Daylight made that food source more dangerous. The deeper dark offered less to eat, but a better chance of staying alive. That trade-off shaped behavior. Behavior repeated at scale became structure. Structure repeated every night became one of the largest migrations on Earth. And the first clear sign of it arrived disguised as a moving seafloor. I love that detail, because it feels exactly like something the ocean would do. It did not reveal its secret cleanly. It misled us first. We thought we were looking at bottom. Then the bottom started climbing after dark. Only later did the real answer come into focus. Not a second seafloor, not an instrument error, a living layer, a mass of bodies in motion, a hidden night ascent happening on such a scale that it could fool us into thinking the shape of the ocean itself had changed. That is when the whole story locks into place. The sea is not empty. The sea is not still just because it looks still. The sea is not using the same map all day long. Once daylight fades, a huge amount of life begins moving toward the richest part of the water column. By the middle of the night, that upper zone becomes a temporary feeding ground for animals that spent the day much lower down. A few hours later, dawn starts to take that opportunity away, so they leave. And that leaves us with the question that matters most going into the next part. If the surface has so much food, why is it only worth using under cover of darkness? Why build an entire way of life around a climb that has to be repeated every single night? Why is the upper ocean so valuable and at the same time so hard to trust? That is where the story gets even better. Because the next layer is not really about movement. It is about fear, visibility, and the specific kind of danger that light creates in open water. If the surface is full of food, why does so much life abandon it before morning? That is where the migration stops being just strange and starts making hard sense. Coming up at night is one thing, Building an entire way of life around leaving before sunrise is something else. A pattern that's strict only survives if daylight changes the surface in a serious way. And it does. When the sun is up, the upper ocean becomes much easier to read. For a small animal, that can be disastrous. Out in open water, there is very little that feels like shelter. You do not get a cave. There is no branch waiting for you. Nothing like a rock face appears to hide you. What you get instead is depth, timing, darkness, and whatever your body can do to avoid being noticed. That is why visibility matters so much here. The surface does not become dangerous in the abstract. Bodies begin to stand out. A small grazer drifting through brighter water may only need to be seen once. A fish looking upward does not need a perfect view. A hint of motion can be enough. Sometimes the outline gives everything away. In other moments, one faint flicker is all it takes. That is the pressure sitting over the entire migration. Food is near the surface, but so is exposure. Once that clicks, the timing stops feeling mysterious. These animals are not waiting for the night because darkness is comforting. They are waiting because light raises the cost of being there. That is the real pivot. The surface stays rich after sunrise. Phytoplankton do not vanish in the morning. The grazers still need them. Fish still need the grazers. Predators still know where the traffic will be. What disappears is cover. That one loss is enough to change the whole map. So the question is not where the food is. Everyone already knows where the food is. The more brutal question is when it can be reached, without becoming too easy to find. That is a much sharper way to understand the upper ocean. It is not simply a feeding zone. It is a feeding zone with a price. At noon, the price is high. After sunset, it drops. Before dawn, it begins climbing again. So the migration follows the price. I think that makes the whole event feel more real. From a distance, it can sound graceful. Once you move inside it, everything tightens. Nothing here is built around safety. The dark does not make the upper ocean safe. It improves the odds just enough to make the climb worth attempting. That difference matters. A safe place invites you to stay. Better odds only give you a window. That is why the migration has so much urgency built into it. The animals are not arriving in peace. They are borrowing time. As evening spreads across the sea, that borrowed time starts opening up. At first, the change is small. A layer that was too exposed begins to soften. Then the water above it grows darker still. A few more animals can risk the ascent. Another stretch of depth becomes usable. Soon the whole system begins lifting upward, not as one perfect wave, but as a widening opportunity. That is one of the most important things to picture correctly. The migration does not begin like a bell ringing. It builds. Some animals rise in fading twilight. Others wait for thicker darkness. A few stay lower than the rest. Certain predators move with the same change. By full night, a part of the ocean that looked nearly empty from above can be packed with life. That transformation is easy to miss if you think only in terms of the surface. A calm horizon does not tell you anything. Moonlight on the water does not reveal the traffic below it. Even from a ship, you could be looking straight at apparent stillness, while an entire feeding world is filling in underneath. And that world is not calm. This is where a lot of descriptions become too soft. People sometimes talk about the nightly rise, as if darkness gives small animals a peaceful chance to eat. That is not really what is happening. Predators come up too. The same fading light that helps prey also helps hunters. A fish can use that window. A squid can use it. Anything that benefits from compressed feeding activity can use it. So the upper ocean at night is not kinder than the upper ocean by day. It is simply organized around a different kind of danger. That makes the night migration far more intense than it first sounds. A grazer rises because food is finally reachable at lower cost. A fish follows because the grazer is there. Something larger may track both. Now the water is no longer just rich, it is crowded with hunger. That is the phrase I would keep in mind. Not one appetite, stacked appetites. The animals are sharing the same band of water, but not the same role inside it. One body is trying to feed, another is trying to find that body, a third is watching for both. That is why the upper ocean after dark feels less like a refuge and more like a compressed night market. Everything gathers there because the opportunity is temporary. No one gets to relax inside it. That temporary quality becomes even more brutal when dawn begins. Midnight has tension. Early morning has consequences. Deep night still offers cover. As the sky starts to brighten, the protection begins thinning out. That shift can happen faster than it sounds. A body that blended well an hour ago may suddenly read differently in the water. A layer that felt usable can become exposed. The route back down is still open, but now it is opening into danger in reverse. That is why sunrise matters so much. The descent is not some quiet ending after the real action is over. For many animals, it may be the most critical part of the cycle. Come up too early, and you risk being seen before you can feed properly. Stay too long, and daylight catches you in the wrong place. Leave at the right moment, and you carry the gain back into deeper water. That timing has to work, which is why this whole movement responds to changing light, rather than to any simple fixed schedule. A cloudy night can alter the feel of the upper ocean. Moonlight changes the exposure. Clear water reveals more. Different species tolerate different levels of risk. So even though sonar may show a band rising and sinking, the living reality inside that band is much more complicated. What looks clean from a graph feels messy from inside the ecosystem. Some animals stay deeper under brighter conditions. Others rise higher when darkness is heavier. A few split the difference. Another group may change speed rather than depth. That variation is not noise. It is the event itself. The migration is not a single decision. It is countless decisions made under related pressure. That makes the whole system feel more alive. Not just populated, responsive. And some of those responses are astonishing. Certain midwater animals are nearly transparent. Others carry reflective surfaces that help them disappear in dim light. A few go even further. Instead of glowing to be seen, they use light to cancel their own outline. That idea sounds almost impossible the first time you hear it. A creature produces light in darkness, not to stand out, but to avoid becoming a silhouette. That tells you exactly how severe the visual problem is. The upper ocean is risky enough that evolution found ways to interfere with visibility itself. Even then, nothing becomes easy. No animal solves this problem once and for all. A good body plan helps. Careful timing helps. Deeper daytime refuge helps. Still, none of it erases the danger. What changes is the balance, and only by a little. On some nights, the water is dark enough to hide you a bit better. In other moments, the timing of your ascent trims exposure by a narrow margin. Closer to dawn, staying alive may depend on leaving early instead of feeding a little longer. The surface never turns safe. For a short while, it becomes manageable enough to use. And when that small advantage is repeated across millions and billions of animals, the sea reorganizes itself every night. That is what makes the migration feel so huge without ever feeling easy. Every individual is working with a narrow margin. Taken together, those margins reshape the water column. And once you start seeing the upper ocean that way, it stops being one place. At midday, it is bright, productive, and costly. After sunset, it becomes usable enough to enter. Toward dawn, the price rises again. So the same patch of water keeps changing character without moving anywhere at all. That is one of the deepest truths in the story. The ocean is not organized by location alone. Conditions redraw the map. Light does not merely illuminate the surface. It changes where life can afford to be. That is the force behind the migration. Food explains the destination. Exposure explains the timing. Put those two pressures together, and the movement starts to look almost inevitable. But the upper ocean at night does more than gather animals. It intensifies encounters. Bodies that were spread across depth during the day end up using a narrower band after dark. That means contact rates rise, feeding speeds up, predators find more chances, escapes become more frantic. Energy moves through the system faster because so many lives are briefly operating in the same vertical zone. That is why the night ocean can feel compressed. Not compressed in a physical sense, compressed in consequence. More of life is suddenly trying to use the same opportunity before the clock runs out. And the clock always runs out. That fact gives the whole migration its edge. Everything about that upper layer is temporary. Trust it too much, and you stay too long. Feed there too early, and you expose yourself too soon. The window works, but only for a while. Animals rise because the moment is usable. They leave because usability never lasts. That simple structure is harsh, but it works. And once you follow it closely enough, the story starts getting bigger. At first, this looked like a strange behavioral pattern. Later, it became a story about risk. Stay with it a little longer, and another layer opens. The animals do not return to depth empty. That matters more than it may seem. They rise into a surface world powered by sunlight. They feed there. Then they descend, carrying some of that gain inside their own bodies. So the migration is not only moving creatures through the dark, it is moving material from one layer of the ocean to another. That is the turn that changes the scale again. Now we are no longer talking only about feeding success, predator avoidance, or daily timing. Now the migration starts touching something larger. Carbon taken up near the surface does not always stay there. Energy gathered in the upper ocean can be carried downward when the animals return to deeper water. Repeat that across enormous regions of sea, and the nightly commute becomes part of a hidden transport system. I love that shift in perspective. What first looks like a desperate little survival routine starts opening into something planetary. A small animal rises because it needs to eat. It sinks because daylight makes the surface hard to trust. Multiply that by vast numbers, and the result becomes part of the way the ocean moves matter through the planet. That is such an ocean kind of revelation. The event gets bigger every time you look at it from a new angle. It first hits you with scale. After that, the story sharpens into fear. Stay with it longer, and it expands into transport. All of that depends on one uncomfortable truth. The surface gives, and the surface exposes. Sunlight creates the food-rich zone. That same sunlight also helps turn the zone into a dangerous place to remain. So life does not solve the problem permanently. It answers it nightly. The animals wait below, then rise when the cost drops enough. Feed under borrowed cover, and leave before the terms change again. That rhythm is not beautiful because it is gentle. It is beautiful because it holds under pressure. There is a difference. This migration is not some elegant luxury of the sea. It is a repeated answer to a repeated problem. How do you reach the richest water in the ocean without becoming too visible while you are there? For many species, the answer is never perfect. What matters is that enough of them survive for the climb to remain worth repeating. That is why the pattern keeps returning. The problem comes back every day. Evening lowers the cost again. Bodies begin rising. Dawn raises the cost again. The sea empties back into depth. That is the pulse underneath the whole part. These animals are not simply going up to feed. They are negotiating with light. And when they head back down, they take more than a full stomach with them. They carry the surface world into the dark. That is where the next part begins. Because once enough life feeds near the top, then sinks again with that material inside it, the migration becomes more than a nightly risk. It becomes part of the hidden pump beneath the planet. By this point, the migration already feels enormous. But the strangest part may be what happens after the feeding is over. The climb matters, but the return may matter even more. That is where the scale changes again. At first, this looked like movement. Then it became a story about risk. Now it starts opening into something much larger. Because the animals do not come back down empty. They rise into the surface world, feed there, and return carrying part of that surface world inside them. That is the turn that changes everything. The upper ocean is where sunlight enters the system. Phytoplankton grow there. Tiny grazers feed on them. Larger animals feed on those grazers. So when the migration rises after dark, it is not just entering a busier part of the sea. It is entering the layer where sunlight has already been converted into food. That detail is easy to miss at first. The surface is not simply crowded, it is productive. It is where carbon is taken up. It is where energy first becomes available to the rest of the food web. When animals feed there at night, some of that gain stays with them as they descend. So the return trip is not just a retreat into deeper water. It is a transfer. Material is moving. Energy is moving. What was built near the surface is being carried downward through living bodies. Once that clicks, the migration stops feeling like a strange nightly commute. It starts looking more like a hidden delivery system running beneath the planet. And the story does not end with a full stomach. Some of that material is used deeper in the water through breathing, digestion, growth, waste, predation, and death. Some passes from one animal into another. Some sinks farther still. Some reaches depths where it may stay out of fast circulation for a very long time. That means the descent is doing more than returning animals to cover. It is helping move carbon away from the atmosphere-connected surface and into deeper parts of the ocean. That is a serious shift in perspective. The sea is not just holding life, it is processing the planet through life. One of the engines inside that process is this nightly rise and fall through darkness. I think this is the moment when the migration becomes hard to forget. At the beginning, the size of it is what shocks you. Later, the fear inside it sharpens the picture. By the time you get here, the whole thing starts feeling almost unbelievable. Tiny animals, many of them easy to ignore on their own, follow the changing pressure of light and risk, and together, they help move matter through one of Earth's largest systems. That is such a strange form of power. No single creature is trying to do any of this. Nothing in the migration is planned for the good of the planet. Each animal is solving an immediate problem. It needs food, it needs lower exposure. It rises when the odds improve, then drops back when the danger begins to return. But when that answer is repeated across immense numbers, night after night, over huge areas of ocean, the result becomes planetary. That is one of the ocean's deepest truths. A local decision, repeated at absurd scale, can create a global consequence. The sea does not always change the world through dramatic giants. Sometimes it gets there through number, through repetition, through small lives pushed by the same pressure. That is exactly what is happening here. A copepod is not thinking about climate. A lanternfish is not trying to help regulate the Earth. A drifting grazer does not know anything about planetary systems. Still, their movements matter at that level. That is the shock. An animal rises because it is hungry. It goes back down because sunrise makes the surface harder to trust. Multiply that by millions and billions of bodies, and the ocean begins carrying the surface world into the deep. This is where the water column stops feeling like a stack of layers and starts feeling like a living connection. The top is not isolated. The dark below is not cut off. Something is always being handed from one zone to another, not in one clean motion, not through a single species, not with perfect efficiency, but reliably enough and broadly enough that the effect becomes part of how the planet works. That is why people talk about a pump, not because the ocean feels mechanical up close. Nothing about the actual event feels mechanical. Predators miss, prey escape, bodies drift off course, timing shifts, light changes. The whole thing is messy because life is messy. Even so, the larger effect remains. Energy captured near the surface does not stay neatly locked in the top layer. Part of that story is carried downward, again and again, through the migration. This is also why the twilight zone matters so much. From the surface, it can seem like an in-between place, too dark to feel familiar, not deep enough to match people's image of the abyss. It sounds almost like a waiting room between better-known worlds. In reality, it is one of the great working layers of the ocean. Huge amounts of life pass through it. Predators feed there. Material moves through it. Carbon moves through it. Every night, the migration turns that whole dim region into a zone of exchange, where surface energy begins its trip downward. That makes the twilight zone feel much less like empty middle water, and much more like active infrastructure. This handoff is easy to overlook, because it happens through ordinary biological acts. Animals eat, they digest, they grow, they excrete, they get hunted, they die. None of those actions looks grand on its own. Put them together across a global ocean, and they begin to change the chemistry of the world. That is one reason the sea is so hard to hold in your head. Its biggest processes do not always announce themselves as one huge spectacle. They often emerge from countless small events, repeated at outrageous scale. The nightly migration is one of the clearest examples of that. You can begin with a tiny animal rising toward the surface to feed. At first, that sounds almost too small to matter. Keep following the chain, and you end up at a planetary consequence. That jump in scale is extraordinary. It also tells you something unsettling about climate systems. People tend to imagine global processes through obvious images: ice sheets breaking, wildfire smoke spreading, storms turning over whole coastlines. Those things matter. But the ocean also works through quieter engines. A small body feeding under cover of darkness, then slipping back into deeper water before dawn, can become part of a system large enough to matter to the air above it. That is astonishing. It gives the migration a different kind of weight. Now it is not only biologically impressive, it becomes structurally important. Take it away, and the ocean would not merely look different. It would function differently. That is harder to sit with. This is not some decorative behavior of marine life. It is part of how the sea does its work, even though nothing about the moment-to-moment experience feels like machinery. Each animal is still dealing with the same old problem. Food is near the top. Exposure is near the top too. Darkness reduces that cost for a while. Then dawn begins raising it again. None of that changes. What changes is our ability to see the consequence. Once enough animals feed near the surface, then carry part of that gain downward, the ocean has found a way to move material out of its most exposed layer. That matters because the surface ocean is tightly linked to the atmosphere. The deeper ocean is not linked in the same immediate way, so the migration becomes one part of the long exchange between sea and sky. Carbon enters the upper ocean. Life uses it. Then life helps move part of it deeper. This is not the whole carbon cycle, but it is one of its hidden chapters. Hidden is exactly the right word. Almost nobody looking across the sea at night would guess that anything this large is underway. The surface still keeps its secret. It reflects moonlight. It catches the wind. It can look empty when it wants to. Meanwhile, below that quiet skin, an immense biological system is already in motion. That contrast never really loses its force. The ocean can appear still while transport is happening. It can look dark while work is being done. It can seem empty while one of Earth's largest migrations is redistributing the products of sunlight. That mismatch between appearance and reality is part of what makes the story feel so deep. Even once you understand the mechanism, it still feels slightly unreal. A person can stand over open water and see almost nothing. Below, timing, fear, feeding, predation, and transport are all unfolding together. This is probably the point where the migration stops being just a fascinating fact. It becomes a way of seeing the ocean differently. The sea is not just habitat. It is not just scenery. It is not simply a container holding animals and currents. It is an active exchange, full of transfers, full of invisible labor, full of consequences that stay hidden from the surface. Every night, the migration makes that visible, at least to anyone who knows how to think about it. Bodies rise into the food-rich upper ocean. Before daylight fully returns, many of those bodies head back down. Some of what they gained remains inside them. Some is passed to something else. Some sinks farther through the system. All of that means the surface does not keep everything it creates. That is a profound idea. The ocean takes what light produces and sends part of it downward through living movement. No giant hand is doing that. No central plan is guiding it. The system emerges because life is trying to survive inside a difficult map. That may be the most beautiful part of the story. Not beautiful in a soft way, beautiful in a hard way. The logic holds. The pressure is real. The timing matters. And out of that tension, something enormous takes shape. What begins as a migration turns out to be part of a transport system. Stay with it long enough, and that transport system starts looking like one of the hidden pumps beneath the planet. By then, the nightly rise no longer feels like a side note of marine biology. It feels fundamental. You could almost say the ocean is breathing through behavior. Not literally, but the image gets close to the feeling. At night, life rises toward the zone where sunlight built the feast. When morning approaches, much of that life withdraws, carrying part of that surface story into deeper water. That repeated motion helps shape the ocean's role in the wider planet. And still, many of the animals involved are small enough to overlook. I love that detail. The system does not need fame. It does not depend on spectacle. It does not require one legendary creature to hold it together. Its force comes from repetition. One animal makes the trip, then another does, then many more do. Keep scaling that up, and eventually the sea is no longer asking whether the movement feels impressive to us. It is already changing the world with it. That is the final shift in scale. At the beginning of the story, the migration feels hidden. By the end, it feels indispensable. You start with a moving layer that sonar mistakes for the seafloor. Then the mystery turns into a night ascent, driven by hunger and exposure. Keep following the logic, and the whole thing opens into a transport system, linking the sunlit surface to the deeper ocean below. That is not a minor reveal. It changes what kind of story this is. What began as a mystery becomes a structure. What looked like animal behavior becomes planetary process. And the ocean never has to announce any of it loudly. That feels exactly right. Some of the biggest truths in the sea arrive quietly. A dark surface, a blank horizon, a moving layer no one expected. Then, little by little, the logic opens. What rises is life. What returns downward carries more than life. It carries energy. It carries carbon. It carries part of the work the ocean does beneath the planet. Once you know that, the open sea can never look quite as empty again. Even a calm night feels different. The silence starts to look misleading. The darkness starts to feel busy. The surface no longer seems like the whole story. Below it, countless bodies may already be rising toward the richest water they can safely use. A few hours later, many of them will be gone again, sinking back into deeper layers with part of that surface world inside them. That movement is ancient. It is relentless. Most of it goes unseen, and it may be one of the clearest examples of how the ocean hides world-sized processes inside small lives. That is the feeling I would end on. The largest migration on Earth happens in total darkness. At first, that sounds like a strange fact. By now, it should feel like something much larger. A hidden rhythm, a daily gamble, a living transport system. A reminder that the planet is being shaped, even in places that look still enough to ignore. And all of it begins with one narrow nightly window. The light fades, the cost drops, life rises. Later, morning begins rebuilding the danger, and the ocean pulls its traffic back into the dark. That cycle has been running for ages. It is running tonight. And under a sea that may look completely silent from above, the hidden pump beneath the planet is already at work.